Well, as the French would say, it's marche, marche, marche. March. Anyway, so yeah, it's March, and these are my movies by month for March. These are the things I watched. I saw a couple of films at the cinema this time, so let's go instead straight into the films I watched on streaming or on home media. Well, we know that not all films are masterpieces, and we've been through the dregs of some seriously intentional schlock here, but I don't think anything's ever quite managed to be both as deliberately cacky and as joyously silly as Lieutenant Jangles. So yeah, this is the one that's basically, it's that old Stallone movie, Cobra, crossed with some bits of Miami Vice, and essentially taking the piss out of any 80s movie about one tough cop, where there's like that one hard-ass cop who runs around shooting bad guys against the mob or the gang or the conspiracy or whatever, you know. Only this time, this is made by a whole bunch of pissed up Australians who clearly were having an absolutely whale of a time and weren't taking any of it seriously. Now, in some ways I would say this is actually a better movie than a lot of the low-rent cheesy Bocassa-likes of this world, but it also does suffer from being far, far too long, and taking way, way too long for it actually to get started. I mean, even like the opening shootout goes on for nearly 10 minutes, and there's just no need, because it's not funnier because it goes on longer. It's a 2 out of 5, because, I mean, it's garbage. It's fun garbage, but it's still garbage. And not in the hot Shirley Manson kind of way. A far better film that graced one Friday film and Sunday night was The Courier. And that was this period drama based on the true story starring Fumius Bandersnatch as a real-life undercover agent and document curer who helped the US and British governments pass info from inside the USSR in the lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. This being a true story, there was only so much that the writers could do in terms of like spinning tension out of this tale. Now, some willy won't he get caught stuff, you know, that was dangled there, offset with a bit of half-hearted family drama, and, you know, will he fall out with his wife? Nothing too serious or in-depth. But I think the film's biggest failing for me was that I felt it could have actually done with more tension and maybe a slightly less strict adherence to the real timeline of the story. But I mean, otherwise, 3 out of 5. I mean, great acting from Bumblewitch, Booblecatcher, and from Jessie Buckley as well. And yeah, all hands on this film did a pretty good job. It looked pretty solid, and yeah, it was a pleasantly entertaining experience and actually quite enlightening. But lest you think things might tip on the scale of actual good and worthy entertainment for too long, there was also Greenland, which managed to do the amazing job of being both wholly predictable disaster movie schlock, but also fun and enjoyable bit of daftness. Now, basically, this was all about Gerard Butler, hard-working architect dad on the verge of a proper breakup with his wife, her off Firefly, when he gets a message from the government about a passing comet that might just wipe out all of humanity, and he's been picked to go into the magical vault of specialness. There's a lot of that comet stuff going around at the moment, certainly in the cinema world.
That a giant comet the size of Mount Everest hurtling its way towards planet Earth is not a fucking good thing!
But yeah, it turns out they've got space for him and the fam in this vault in Greenland, so off they trot, but oops, they leave his son's meds in the car and have to go back, and then they get separated, and of course then there's other problems and big adventure and chase against the clock. This was passable entertainment. I mean, the writing here isn't bad, but it's certainly not good. And this is way more Dante's Peak than something like 2012. For starts, they didn't have the budget of anything like that. So your total great apocalypse porn shots, like all the kind of gubbins, that's not there. And it made up for it by not being completely shit. So 3 out of 5 for not being completely shit, and providing the bare minimum rung of entertainment quality before things started slipping back into the cesspool. Sequel comes out soon. And from the horrors of B-movie cheese to the highest rungs of art and culture, because I watched The Tragedy of MacBeth. Now this one is a clear-cut classic for obvious reasons, because it's literally Shakespeare, but also because Denzel Washington, Frances McDormand working for one of the Coen brothers, I'm not sure which, but anyway, this dropped on Apple TV, and it's decent, for sure. I mean, it's all shot in square format, in stark black and white, which I think is supposed to be mimicking the kind of old black and white, very stagey Shakespearean films of like the 40s and 50s. And do they do it justice? Kind of. I mean, there's a lot of great talent here, and stylistically you really can't fault that they've gone for this artistic look. But at the same time, it's really hard not to compare this negatively to the Justin Wurzel Macbeth from a few years ago, which took the step of actually going for proper historical accuracy in design. I mean, not to the expense of making it unfun and uninteresting to look at, because it was still slightly stylized, but they actually went for the proper period. And it's amazing. Every shot of it is beautiful, and also because in that one you kind of felt like the actors understood the lines, and I hate to say it, McDormand and Washington still have that problem where it sounds like they're reciting stereo instructions or like a nuclear physics textbook, because it's plain they aren't quite sure what they're saying means. I can only give this 3 out of 5. It's not the best Macbeth out there, there's a lot better. But it's not bad, and if you've got Apple TV, you might as well check it out between watching episodes of Ted Lasso and that movie Coda to see why it won some Oscars. Slightly less cultural, but also on a streaming service, was Alive, a Korean movie that dropped on Netflix last winter. And that was all about this guy called Jun-woo, who's a bit of a waster, spends his time streaming on Twitch and hanging out in his parents' house when, wouldn't you know it, a full-blown zombie apocalypse breaks out, stranding him alone in his flat, with dwindling food supplies and no way out of the building, let alone to some form of safety. I mean, he can barely get out of his flat for most of the film. 4 out of 5, straight up. This is quick-paced, rollicking, good entertainment, and yes, there are several points in it where there's massive holes in logic and clear things where you would think the character would do something else or make another choice. Like, for example, he apparently runs out of food on like day 4 or 5, and yet by day 20 he seems no less starving than he did in day 6. In fact, if anything, he seems less bothered, despite having done nothing but literally neck his dad's fancy whiskey collection for a fortnight. Anyway, as far as Korean cinema goes, it's not the weirdest thing out there. It's pretty just bog standards in terms of it being not weird and crazy and out there like so much of it. But yeah, it's just a solidly entertaining film that you'll have a lot of fun with. And here's another curiosity off Netflix. The Witcher: Nightmare of the Wolf. This is an animated movie, and it's actually technically a prequel to the Witcher TV show.
Toss a coin to your Witcher, oh Valley of Plenty.
Yeah, that one. But it's set hundreds of years before the characters are really kicking around on that one, and some of it actually ties into the second season, apparently, which I still haven't watched. But yeah, it's about young and talented Witcher called Vesemir who comes into conflict with a sorceress called Tetra, who's rallying all the locals against Witchers. And it's kind of an interesting story, delving into that time when there were a lot more Witchers in the world and how they trained and lived, and in the days before Geralt and his town-to-town wanderings as a monster-hunting vagabond. And basically this is kind of an action anime type deal with a lot of fighting and monsters and not a massive amount in terms of plot, but it's certainly not lacking. And it's 3 out of 5. It's a nice little peek into the wider story world and a lot of fun that fans of the show will definitely benefit from before watching season 2 if they haven't already. Like me, because I am so behind with that show. And as I mentioned earlier, I did the unthinkable this month and actually saw 2 films at the cinema instead of just 1. I know, right? Crazy. And the first one I saw was The Batman. Yes, no shock there, The Batman, only the biggest film since Beyond Spider-Man Gubbins that came out a couple of months back. And true to form, The Dark Knight has risen again in this franchise reboot set when Bruce Wayne was still a tortured young man, but has actually already been doing the Batman stuff for about a year now. So basically, if you've seen Batman Begins, this would come straight after that, but it doesn't because it's technically a different continuity, multiverse, wibbly wobbly, whatever. But the story picks up where a serial killer who loves riddles starts to put Gotham into a spin of terror, and only Batman can detective his way into finding out who the guy is and getting embroiled in the shenanigans of the Penguin, sexy woman cat burglar, see what I did there, and local mob boss Falcone. Now, what sets this apart from the other Batman films is that instead of a really comic-y looking feel like some earlier ones, or the grim, dark, modern, brutalist Nolan type of movie, this feels much more like a serial killer film. This film literally doesn't look like a comic book film at all. It looks like David Fincher's movie Seven, which is definitely something they based it off of. And it's got that same grim, dark feel and the prankishly evil serial killer who likes setting up weird puzzles and things, and killing folk in strange ways in a dark, rainy city. It's also similar in a lot of ways to Fincher's star-studded 4-hour-long procedural epic Zodiac about the real-life serial killer of the same name. Now, you can see both of those movies' DNA all over the Batman, and I think that's great. And Robert Pattinson, who's come a huge long way from being a glittery vampire guy in films that kids like, to crazy arthouse madness stuff, and here he shows that he can also be a tough guy and a tortured vigilante nutcase. And this is easily 4 out of 5. If I had to really lodge complaints about this, it would be that the film is way too long, because I mean it's 3 hours long and you really start to feel it, especially in the big tacked on end set piece that feels like it was mandated by the studio instead of it growing organically out of the existing movie's logic and plot. But this is a proper cinematic blockbuster, and it's a really interesting new take on that classic Batman franchise. And another long-running franchise movie that I saw was Death on the Nile, although in this case, this is actually on the second film in Kenneth Branagh's reinterpretation of the Agatha Christie classic novels into movie form after his previous success on the really good Murder at the Orient Express. Now this is Death on the Nile, where Poirot and his pal Book end up tagging along on the honeymoon of Wonder Woman and the Lone Ranger. But then a murder happens, funnily enough, and they have to make sure that they can solve the plot before they return to port and anyone can escape. And as you might expect, this is a proper murder mystery. I mean, this is Agatha Christie at her best, with a tangled web of motives, suspects, complicated shenanigans, and frankly, it's as good or better than the first film. So easily 4 out of 5, with the only downside being that the beginning of the movie is kind of choppy and slow, but also has some really, really ropey green screen shots of people hanging out by the pyramids and the Sphinx that kind of let the film down because they look pretty bad and cheap. But still, it's an absolute blast and an entertaining version of this film, and I really hope they continue making more movies in this franchise series. So that was March, and that's me basically up to date with these movies by month so far. Sorry it's taken a little while to get the first 3 months of the year done, but as I said before, I've been pretty busy, and now that I've actually got a bit of free time, to be honest, between these videos, the Halo video I did, and all the Outlander coverage I've been doing, I'm finding I'm having a lot less free time than I thought I was going to have. But yeah, I'm going to keep making these, I'll keep doing the Outlander videos, and I'll try and sneak in a few other things here and there. But yeah, I hope people are having fun, and until next time, these have been my grumpy opinions.